Hi guys, Reverend Crystal Cox here, and I'm going to read to you today out of this book. It's called not Mr. 1900, or, I think the first word is or. So the title is either 1900, it says, or The Last President. First edition 1896, Ingersoll Lockwood, new edition 2017, edited by blah blah blah. Okay, so this was written in 1896. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this. And in the description box will be a PDF link to the full book and an audio to listen to it on YouTube. I'm not going to read the whole book right now. I'm just going to read a little bit. This is the one that everybody's talking about that was written in the 1800s about what seems to be connected to Donald Trump's presidency now. There's an Secretary of Agriculture, Pence, and he's the last president. And so, and those of us who follow Nasara, Jassara, and all that, we know that he's the last president and then the first president. Anyway, if you don't know that, you don't know that. So, the back of this book says, this little booklet was penned at the end of the 19th century and involves events mere later. Ostensibly. I have to check that word out. Not familiar with that one. A work of political satire. It chastises the rise of socialism and populism, inferring their fictional rise here as disastrous and leading to chaos. It is of note here that this work, along with others by Lockwood, appear to prognosticate the current political climate of the United States and West at large, and for an apparent religious Catholic of his era, it is not altogether impossible that Lockwood, sound a little bit like Linwood, wittingly or unwittingly, tapped into some mystic forces. Regardless, it is an interesting little political story from its time and is reflective of some of the social ideologies and movement of the day. It is, a lot of people believe that Trump's grandfather, as the story goes, was hired to understand Tesla's inventions because they got rid of Tesla, right? And he said he couldn't. And then he did, and he time traveled. And so that's why, like the Simpsons stuff and a lot of the stuff you see is already time travel. But like I said in my previous video tonight, quantum I forgot that. I guess saying like what I said in my previous video. But anyway, right, that each step, we don't know what's going to happen right now. And that's since 2012. So we could kind of predict it through quantum computers, through remote viewing, through different ways. But everything changed. And so now we go a little bit into it and then it changes. A little bit into it and then it changes. And this book is kind of reflective of how quantum, timeline, supernatural, divine this all is. Okay, so a work of mimetic occultism. So mimetic is spelled M-E-M-E-T-I-C and then occultism. Okay, let's see. The following is an interesting short story written toward the end of the 19th century by Ingersoll Lockwood on the subject of U.S. politics. This work was apparently little noticed, like all of Lockwood's works, until this self-same year of 2017, when connections were made between not one but several of the author's writings and the current troubled political situation in the Western world has now found itself in. Here I will expound a few of the connections seen in this short story, but I must first remark briefly upon the author himself. Relatively little is known of Lockwood. It seems that over the course of some years he wrote a few fiction novels about a figure called Baron Trump in the 1800s. The surname of which happens to be the same as the current President of the United States. One connection thus noticed, along with at least two works on Catholic saints and miracles, as well as this current work, which I have edited here, modernizing some of the language and cleaning up the format, since no apparent modern edition of this work has been made. Within the context of this work, there are several definitive connections with the current political situation, which I list here. First, the presence of a Pence with the cabinet of fictional president here, of course the surname of the current vice president. Secondly, a literal reference to prognostication, that is prediction or prophecy, a foreawareness of coming events in specific or general terms. Third, the rise of socialism, anarchism, and separatism we're seeing right now. Fourth, the general movement we see explicitly today of all sides calling for grievances to be addressed, which leads to the subsequent effects, the dissolution of the Republic into 3 blocks and general chaos in the meantime prior. 3 blocks. The significance of these connections, when paired with both obvious and apparent connections to modernity and Lockwood's other works, rendered this booklet, in my opinion, to the status of predictive. I must note that Lockwood's fascination with miracles, saints, and socio-political movements indicate to me a very high likelihood that he was a practicing occultist of his era. I say this only as a probability, based on my understanding of the occultism that reigned from roughly the 1870s into the 1910s, during which time religious Christians tended not to see healing, magic, engineered prayer, herbal lore, or ceremonialism as sinful. They tend to see it as sinful or wrong. Indeed, the invariable Christian Victorian crowd adored parlor magic, seances, psychics, and everything associated with them. Somewhere along the lines, it seemed Lockwood went past crafting a short political satire and delved into something deeper. Regardless, the semblance of this work to modernity is uncanny to a frightful degree. Ooh, frightful! If he was indeed not practicing some of the foresight, he tapped into the same unwittingly. The sheer number of synchronicities connection between his works and the 2010s is significant enough that I first assumed the very existence of the work to be an elaborate hoax, but their availability predates the rise of current political situation, and physical copies from their own era have been sporadically found as well. The works are real. I class them, therefore, with perhaps general lore regarding Nostradamus or something of that kind. Okay. The last president. The Chicago platform assumes, in fact, the form of a revolutionary propaganda. It embodies a menace of national disintegration and destruction. Garrett A. Hobart. Okay, Chapter 1. That was terrible night for the great city of New York. The night of Tuesday, November 3rd, 1896. The city staggered under the blow like a huge ocean liner, which plunges full speed with a terrific crash into a mighty iceberg and recoils shattering and trembling like an aspen. The people were gathered, light-hearted and confident, at the evening meal. When the news burst upon them, it was like a thunderbolt out of the azure sky. Atgeld holds Illinois hard and fast in the Democratic line. This elects Bryan President of the United States. Strange to say, the people in the upper portion of the city made no movement to rush out of their houses and collect in the public squares. Although the night was clear and beautiful, they sat as if paralyzed with a nameless dread. And when they conversed, it was with bated breath and throbbing hearts. In less than half an hour, mounted policemen dashed through the streets calling out, "Keep within your houses, close your doors, and barricade them." The entire East Side is in a state of uproar. Mobs of vast sizes are organizing under the lead of anarchists and socialists and threaten to plunder and despoil the houses of the rich who have wronged and oppressed them for so many years. Keep within doors. Extinguish all lights. This is pretty scary stuff. Happily, Governor Morton was in town, and although a deeper pallor overcame the ashen hue of age as he spoke, yet there was no tremor in his voice. "Let the 72nd and 71st Regiment be ordered under arms." Sounds familiar? In a few moments, hundreds of messengers could be heard racing through the silent streets, summoning the members of these regiments to their armories. Slowly, but with astonishing nerve and steadiness, the mobs pushed the police northward, and although the force stood the onslaught with magnificent courage, yet beaten back, the dark masses of infuriated beings surged up against with renewed fury and strength. "Will the troops be in time to save the city?" was the whispered inquiry among the knots of police officials who were directing the movements of their men. About 9 o'clock, with deafening outcries, the mob, like a four-headed monster breathing fire and flame, raced, tore, burst, raged into Union Square. The police force was exhausted, but their front was still like a wall of stone, except for that it was movable. The mob crowded it steadily to the north, while the air quivered and was rent with shouts of the victors. "Bryan is elected! Bryan is elected! Our day has come at last! Down with our oppressors! Death to the rich man! Death to the gold bugs! Death to the capitalists! Give us the money back you have ground out of us! Give us back the marrow of our bones which you have used to grease the wheels of your chariots." Quite the parallel, huh? The police force was now almost helpless. The men still used their sticks, but the blows were ineffectual, and only served to increase the rage of the vast hordes now advancing upon Madison Square. The Fifth Avenue Hotel will be the first to feel the fury of the mob. The Fifth Avenue Hotel? Sound familiar? Would the troops be in time to save it? So what we're going through now, right, represents the Fifth Avenue Motel, which is Trump Tower. A half cheer, a half cry of joy goes up. It is inarticulate. Men draw a long breath. Women drop upon their knees and strain their eyes. They can hear something, but they cannot see it. For the gas houses and electric plants had been destroyed by the mob earlier in the evening. They preferred to fight in the dark or by the flames of rich men's abodes. Again, a cheer goes up. Louder and clearer this time, followed by the cries of, "They're coming! They're coming!" Yes, they were coming. The 22nd down Broadway, the 7th down Madison Avenue, both on the double quick. In a moment or so there were a few bugle calls, and a few spoken commands rang out clearly and sharp, and then the two regiments stretched across the entire square, literally from wall to wall in line of battle. The mob was upon them. Would this slender line of troops, could it hold such a mighty mass of men in check? The answer was a deafening discharge of firearms, a terrific crack, such as some thunderbolts make when they explode. A wall of fire blazed across the square. Again and again it blazed forth. The mob halted, stood fast, wavered, fell back, advanced again. At that moment there came a rattle as of huge knives in the distance. It was the gallant 71st charging up 23rd Street and taking the mob on the flank. They came on like a wall of iron, bristling with blades of steel. There was no outcries, no cheers from the regiment. It dealt out death in silence, save when two bayonets... You find it weird when they say save then, because now we say except when. Okay, so save when two bayonets crossed and clashed in bearing down some doubly vigorous foe. As the bells rang out midnight, the last remnants of the mob were driven to cover, but the wheels of the dead wagons rattled till daybreak. And then the aged governor, in response to the mayor's "Thank God we've saved the city," made answer, "Aye, but the Republic." All right. So, let's see here. Chapter 2. Great as has been the world's wonder at the uprising of Mr. Bryan's struggling masses in the city by the sea, and the narrow escape of its magnificent homes from fire and brand, yet greater still was the wonderment when the news was flashed across the land that Chicago did not stand in need of a single federal soldier. Chicago is mad, but it is the madness of joy. Chicago is in the hands of a mob, but it is a mob made of her own people, noisy, rude, and boisterous, the natural exaltation of suddenly enfranchised class, but bent on no other mischief than glorifying over the villainous and self-seeking souls who have ground the faces of the poor and turned the pitiless screw of social and political power into the hearts of the common people, until its last thread had been reached and despair pressed its lupine visage hard against the door of the laboring man. And yet, at this moment, when the night air quivered with the mad shouts of the common people, that the Lord had been good to them, that the wicked money changers had been driven from the temple, that the stony-hearted insurers were beaten at last, that the people's William was at the helm now, that peace and plenty would in a few moons come back to the poor man's cottage, that silver was king, aye, king at last. The world still went wondering why red-eyed anarchy as she stood in Haymarket Square, with thin arms aloft, with wild mien and wild gesticulation, drew no bomb of dynamite from her bosom to hurl at the hated minions of the law, who were silent spectators of this delirium of popular joy. Why was this? Look, and you shall know why white-robed peace kept step with this turbulent band and turned its thought from red-handed pillage. He was there, the master spirit, to hold them in leash. He and he alone had lifted Bryan to his great eminence. Without these 24 electoral votes, Bryan had been doomed, hopelessly doomed. He and he alone held the great Commonwealth of the West hard and fast in the democratic line. Hence he came as conqueror, as kingmaker, and the very walls of the sky, touching edifices, trembled as he was dragged through the streets by this orderly mob, and 10 times 10,000 of his creatures bellowed his name and shook their head aloft in mad exultation. You're our savior! You've cleansed the temple liberty of its foul hordes of usurers. That word is U-S-U-R-E-R-S. I'm not familiar with that word. We salute you. We call you kingmaker. Bryan shall call you master too. You shall have your reward. You shall stand behind the throne. Your wisdom shall make us whole. You shall purge the land of this unlawful crowd of moneylenders. You shall save the republic. You are greater than Washington. You are a better friend of ours than Lincoln. You'll do more for us than Grant. We're your slaves. We salute you. We thank you. We bless you. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. But yet this vast throng of tamed monsters, this mighty mob of momentarily good-natured haters of established order, broke away from the master's control for a few moments and dipped their hands in the enemy's blood. The deed was swift as it was terrible. There were but 4 of them, unarmed, on pleasure bent. At sight of these men, 1,000 throats belched out a deep and awful growl of hatred. They were brave men and backed against the wall to die like brave men. Stricken down, beaten, torn, trampled, dragged, it was quick work. They had faced howling savages in the far west, painted monsters in human form, but never had they heard such yells leaving the throats of men. And so they died. 4 brave men, clad in the blue livery of the Republic, whose only crime was that some months back, against the solemn protest of the master, their comrade, had set foot on the soil of the Commonwealth and saved the metropolis of the West from the hands of this same mob. And so Chicago celebrated the election of the new president, who was to free the land from the grasp of the moneylenders and undo the bad business of years of unholy union between barterers and sellers of human toil and the lawmakers of the land. Throughout the length and breadth of the South and beyond the Great Divide, the news struck hamlet and village like the glad tidings of a new evangel, almost as potent for human happiness as the heavenly message of 2,000 years ago. Bells rang out in joyful acclaim, and the very stars trembled at the telling over and over of what had been done for the poor man by his brethren of the North. And around the blazing pine knots of the southern cabin, and in front of the mining campfires of the far west, the cry went up, "Silver is king! Silver is king!" Black palms and white were clasped in this strange love feast, and the dark-skinned grandchild no longer felt the sting of the lash on his sire's shoulder. All was peace and goodwill, for the people were at last victorious over their enemy, who had taxed and tithed them into a very living death. Now the laborer would not only be worthy of his hire, but it would be paid to him in a people's dollar for the people's good, and now the rich man's coffers would be made to yield up their ill-gotten gain, and the sun would look upon this broad and fair land and find no man without a market for the product of his labors. Henceforth the rich man should, as was right and proper, pay a royal sum for the privilege of his happiness, and take the nation's taxes on his broad shoulders where they belong. Shall we continue reading this? Let me check this, see if it's still recording. All right, well, let's continue. So chapter 3. The pens of many writers would not suffice to describe with anything like historical fullness and preciousness. That word's not preciousness. Okay, let's start that over. The pens of many writers would not suffice to describe with anything like historical fullness and precision the wild scenes of excitement which on the morning after Election Day burst forth on the floors of the various exchanges throughout the Union. The larger and more important the money center, the deeper, blacker, and heavier the despair which sank upon them after the violent outburst of protest, defiance, and execration had subsided. With some, it seemed that visions of their swift but sure impoverishment only served to transform the dark and dismal drama of revolution and disintegration into a side-splitting farce, and they greeted the prospective loss of their millions with loud guffaws and indescribable antics of horseplay and unseemly mirth. And let's add hypocrisy. As the day wore on, the news became worse and worse. It was only too apparent that the House of Representatives of the 55th Congress would be controlled by the combined vote of the populist and free silver men, while the wild joy with which the entire South welcomed the election of Bryan and Sewall left little doubt in the mind of the Northern people that the Southern senators would, to a man, range themselves on the administration side of the great conflict into which the Republic was soon to be precipitated. And to these the 20 senators of the free South states of the North, and the new president would have the Congress of the Republic at its back. There would be nothing to stand between him and the realization of those schemes which an exuberant fancy, untamed by the hand of experience, and scornful of the leading strings of wisdom, can conjure up. Did we say nothing? Nay, not so. For the Supreme Court was still there, and yet Justice Field had come fully up to the 80th milestone in the journey of life, and Justice Gray was nearly 70, while one or two other members of his High Court of Adjudication held to their lives with feeble grasp. Even in due and orderly course events, why might there not come vacancies? Yeah, really, right? Why not? In spite of the nameless dread that rested upon so many of our people and chilled the very blood of the country's industries, the new year 97, sorry, we're in the 1800s here, came hopefully, serenely, almost defiantly in. There was an indescribable something in the air, a spirit of political devil-may-care, a feeling that the old order had passed away, and that the Republic had entered into the womb of time and been born again. We're in the womb of time right now. Hold the line. Trust the plan. This sentiment began to give outward and visible signs of its existence and growth in the remote agricultural districts of the South and far West. They threw aside their working implements, loitered about, gathered in groups, and the words Washington, White House, Silver, Bryan, offices, 2 for 1, the South State, reign of the common people, taxes, incomes, year of jubilee, free coinage, Wall Street, Altgeld, Tillman, Peffer, Coxey were whispered in a mysterious way with heads nodding and pursing up of mouths. In other words, farm chatter, down at the local cafe. As January wore away and February slipping by, Bryan's inauguration nearer and nearer. The groups melted into groups, and it was only too apparent that from a dozen different points in the South and Northwest Coxey armies were forming for an advance on Washington. In some instances they were well clad and well provisioned. In others they were little better than great bands of hungry and restless men, demoralized by idleness and brought up to a strange degree of mental excitement by the extravagant haranguing of their leaders, who were animated but with one thought, namely to make use of these vast crowds of silver pilgrims, as they called themselves, to back up their claims for public office. Okay, these crowds of deluded people were well-named silver pilgrims, for hundreds of them carried in hempen bags pieces of silverware, in 99 cases of 100 plated stuff of a little value, which unscrupulous dealers and peddlers had palmed off upon them as sterling, with the promise that once in Washington the United States Mint would coin their metal into Bryan dollars, giving 2 for 1 in payment for it. While these motley armies marched up the capital of the Republic, the railway trains night and day brought vast crowds of new men, politicians of low degree, men out of employment, drunken and disgruntled mechanics, farmers' sons, to seek their fortunes under the reign of the people, healers and hangers-on of ward bosses, old men who had not tasted office for 30 years or more, ill-inspired by Mr. Bryan's declaration that the American people are not in favor of life tenure in the civil service, that a permanent office-holding class is not in harmony with our institutions, that a fixed term in appointment offices would open the public service to a larger number of citizens without impairing its efficiency, and be better. I mean, my goodness, right? Where else can you get a job in America at 80 years old besides bossing us around? All bearing new brooms in their hand or across their shoulders, each and every one of them supremely confident that in the distribution of the spoils something would surely fall to his share, since they were the common people who were so dear to Mr. Bryan, and who had made him president in the face of the prodigious opposition of the rich man, whose coffers had been thrown wide open to no purpose, and in spite, too, of the satanic and truly devilish power of that hell upon earth known as Wall Street. Sound familiar? The satanic stuff, the one which had sweated gold in vain in its desperate efforts to fasten the chains of trust and the claws of soullessness monsters known as corporations upon these very common people, soon to march in triumph before the silver chariot of the young conqueror from the west. Ooh. All right. I'm going to continue reading the next chapter here. There had been a strange prophecy put forth by someone, and it had made its way into the daily journals, and had been laughingly or seriously commented upon, according to the political tone of the paper, or the passing humor of the writer, that the 4th of March, 1897, would never dawn upon the American people. There was something very curious and uncanny about the prediction, and what actually happened was not qualified to loosen the fearful tension of the public anxiety. For the day literally and truly never dawned upon the city of Washington, and well deserves its historical name, the Dawnless Day. Wow. So that's March 4th. So at 6 o'clock, the hour of daybreak, such an impenetrable pall of clouds overhung the city that there came no sign of day. The gathering crowds could plainly hear the plaintive cries and lamentation put up in the Negro quarters of the city. Not until nearly 9 o'clock did the light cease to shine in darkness, and the darkness began to comprehend it. Oh, I love that. Ceased to shine in the darkness, and the darkness began to comprehend it. So the darkness began to understand the light, and the light was infiltrating the darkness, and that's exactly what's going on. But although it was a cheerless gray day, even at high noon, its heaviness set no weight upon the spirit of the jubilant tens of thousands which completely filled the city and its public parks, and ran over into camps and hastily improved shelters outside the city limits. Not until the day previous had the president announced the name of those selected for his cabinet. The South and far West were fairly beside themselves with joy, for there had been, from their standpoint, ugly rumors abroad for several days. It had been hinted that Bryan had surrendered to the money changers, and that the selection of his constitutional advisers would prove him recreant to the glorious cause of popular government, and that the reign of the common people would remain but a dream of the struggling masses. But this apprehension was short-lived. The young president stood firm and fast on the platform of the parties which had raised him to his proud eminence.